How to reach net zero emissions is a key question in boardrooms and government chambers the world over. In this series, I look at some of the solutions that can help society achieve it. The UN estimates that around $155 billion is currently spent every year on nature-based solutions, less than half of the funding required if we are to limit global warming to below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Closing the gap depends on fast, efficient tools to help drive investment. One mechanism which can support that is carbon markets. So today we're looking at carbon markets, both regulated and voluntary, and asking what can be done to help them grow, be credible and most effective. I'm off to interview Nick Osborne, Head of Environmental Product Trading at Shell. Nick's team is responsible for helping their customers meet their compliance obligations and for sourcing and trading high-quality carbon credits. Nick, thanks so much for talking to me today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, this is a really complex topic, so I think it's good if you can walk us through what carbon markets are and what role they play in meeting net zero.
So I think you need to think about carbon markets in two ways. There are voluntary markets. In the carbon markets, that's what you choose to do. And there are regulated or compliance markets where you have to do something and take action. A compliance market example might be the European Emissions Trading Scheme, where since probably the mid-2000s, the European Union has set targets for climate ambitions, and that's a scheme where you have to buy a credit or an offset to meet your compliance obligations inside the scheme. In the voluntary markets, you build up credits over time. The voluntary markets that use different ways of achieving the objectives to reduce carbon, say forestry, for instance, and planting trees is one. Avoiding trees being cut down in the Amazon, for instance, is another way to do it. In regulated markets, it's generally more of a credit-based approach. So the European Emissions Trading Scheme, for instance, uses an auction method to determine what the cost of compliance is, and then companies that are emitting CO2 into the atmosphere have to comply with this scheme over time.
So can you explain to me why companies are often portrayed as avoiding doing the real work?
Yeah. So I think I need to be really clear here. We see carbon crediting and compensation as very much an and, but it's not an or. It's really part of what we call a kind of carbon reduction mitigation hierarchy. You avoid, you reduce, and then you compensate. So it's critically important that you take these steps and that you can use carbon credit, let's say, to fill in the gaps, but you simply don't use carbon credits as your first port of call.
Why do you think there is such a debate around it?
There's such a debate around this because it's the first time we've ever tried to do this. I think we have to recognise that this market is also an evolution, is that what we saw as quality 10 years ago maybe doesn't look exactly the same as it does today, but we mustn't let perfect be the enemy of the good here. Taking action is the most important thing to do, and then improving that action over time is the second piece.
So we can see the value of carbon credits. Thanks for explaining that as part of a wider decarbonisation strategy. But given the scepticism, the negative press around the voluntary carbon market, can you speak to the integrity of these instruments?
So I think credibility is very much a byproduct of the quality discussion. We want to be absolutely sure that a carbon credit that's generated is real, the mitigation impacts are real, and it can remain credible over time. There are two ways that we look at this. The first of all, with a kind of industry baseline. So there are organisations like a company called Verra, for instance, who verify that your project, its geography, its impact are real, and they are at the levels to be expected. Over and above that, we have an extra internal layer with a number of industry experts who are employed inside Shell to really rigorously look at the other quality factors associated with these projects. So they again look at things like what we call baselining, so the amount of CO2 that is assessed to be released or removed by the project, as well as other critical factors like governance, for instance, and how the projects work. Only when we're satisfied that there is an external verification and our internal quality meets the hurdles would we use the credit either for ourselves or to sell to a customer. Finance
is a real challenge, isn't it, Nick?
Sure, it is. I think carbon markets are a critical part of this process. They allow companies to invest and direct finance into markets and into voluntary schemes or regulated schemes that genuinely have an impact. But also we need to see public financing directed into carbon as well. At the end of the day, we all have the same objective, which is to reduce the carbon outputs. And reducing those carbon outputs needs money and needs investment. Providing credible and long-term ways to make that investment is the role of both markets and the role of regulated schemes. I think we recognise that's a challenge. But the challenges are something we've been overcoming at Shell for decades already. This is a different type of challenge, but one that we're really, really passionate about. We want to make sure we're having an impact in this market. We want to make sure that we're doing the right thing and want to make sure that we're meeting the targets which we've set for ourselves.
It's important, isn't it, for people to understand the rigor?
Sure. Yes, absolutely. The rigor is the critical, and we have experts here. We have people who've been doing this work for 10 or 15 years. And really, 10 or 15 years is a very, very long time in the voluntary carbon markets. These are deep experts. They have high integrity. They understand the technical complexities of the projects, as well as some of the governance issues that are potentially associated with them. And only when they're satisfied using their experience and the knowledge of the current market will they allow us to use the credits.
Just a quick overview now about the benefits.
Sure. I think the benefits of the carbon markets are numerous. I think if you look from the regulated perspective, I think the European Union has the most successful carbon scheme ever globally. It's raised $153 billion since its beginning. It's been extremely effective at reducing industrial emissions. So emissions that sit underneath the European trading scheme have reduced more than 40% in that time, but emissions that haven't have actually increased. So you see the effectiveness of regulation on carbon markets. I think last year we retired about almost 200 million tonnes of voluntary credits, and we're probably on the way to doing something very similar this year. Again, this is about action, the ability to take action, but empirically we're starting to see that happen. We're starting to see access happen, and we're starting to see the beginnings of what can potentially be a very, very successful and very important market.
Nick, lovely to speak to you.
Thank you, it was a pleasure.